I'm now very pleased to turn the stage over to someone who, as soon as you hear her voice, you know she will need no introduction. But since you can't watch radio, you probably don't know Carrie Johnson, who is NPR's criminal justice reporter. And Carrie is here with a good friend of mine and a mentor and also a boss. She is a Vera trustee, Laurie Robinson, who has many more claims to fame than just that. Laurie is a professor at George Mason University and has been a long-time leader at the Department of Justice, and most recently completed quite a gig co-chairing President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. So over to you guys.
Well, we're in for a treat today, and it's worth noting that Laurie Robinson is a two-time veteran of the Justice Department. Of course, she arrived there in the Janet Reno era, and I know, based on strong authority, that Attorney General Eric Holder used whatever power he had to compel her to return, which he was able to convince Laurie to return in this administration, where she served honorably for years. I guess we should start the conversation this way, since in some ways we're talking about the 20th anniversary of the '94 crime bill. You came into the government during that era when policing and community interaction with police were at the top of mind. We're there again. How does today and what we're talking about today harken back to what you came into the government back in the '90s?
Well, Carrie, that's actually a very, very good question. When I joined the Justice Department in 1993 with Janet Reno, actually on my first day at the Justice Department, before I even could go to my desk at Justice, I went to a conference on community policing where she was speaking. And of course, the 1994 crime bill provided the first funding to put President Bill Clinton's 100,000 police on the streets. So that, of course, was at the heart of his criminal justice program. And then we fast forward to today with President Obama's task force on 21st century policing and the report that we just presented to the President just a week ago yesterday. And at the heart of our recommendations, really at the heart of them, is the notion of really focusing on community policing. So that really joins the two together. That really kind of links this. And as we looked in the task force at what's needed in policing today, we hearkened back to some of the themes that were really present at the discussion back in the '90s.
Your task force report, which everyone should read, it's not that long and it's very interesting, at its core talks about the need for police to be part of the communities they serve and not to be faceless individuals, but rather wanting police to get out of their cars, into the communities, and serve the community. How does one do that?
One of the key things that we saw, and I should back up and say that we held in a very short period of time. The President talked about 90 days, but in fact, by the time that he appointed the other members beyond my co-chair, Chuck Ramsey, and me, we were already 18 days into it. So we had a bit of a shorter time than 90 days, but we held 7 listening sessions, as we called them, or hearings. And we heard from over 120 witnesses, and beyond that, we received statements and phone calls and emails from just hundreds of individuals all over the country, and from organizations, from community groups, from advocates, from law enforcement people. So we had a tremendous amount of input. And we heard examples of how communities have really come together and really been able to bridge the gap between law enforcement and community members. So there really are examples of where this has really worked. One of the key approaches that we've recommended is moving, as some have said, from kind of a warrior mindset to a guardian mindset, where law enforcement really is looking after the community and not just adopting, as we say, kind of a warrior mentality.
You also talk, Laurie, in the report about law enforcement needing to do a self-examination, to do an inventory of itself. How important is that? Why would you want them to do that?
Reflection on how you're doing is certainly a key part of moving forward. One of the key aspects of that, in our view, is taking an annual survey of the community to find out how the community is viewing the law enforcement job. How does the community think that the police are doing in their function? And one of our recommendations is that the federal government actually provide a sample survey that law enforcement can use, a police department can use to conduct that. And my co-chair, Chuck Ramsey, also suggests that this be done by zip code within a city, so that, for example, in Washington, D.C., the police chief could tell how Anacostia feels versus Spring Valley, the one less wealthy section of the city versus another.
This is extraordinary, given how many police chiefs around the country and how many mayors and political overseers, city councils. They've placed, for decades now, emphasis on crime statistics. But you're saying measuring community support, or lack thereof, is just as important in some cases as keeping down crime.
Yes, in fact, Charles Welford, who is a leading criminologist at the University of Maryland, has suggested that there be something like a uniform justice report, a UJR, to go along with the UCR, the Uniform Crime Report. And we were very taken with that kind of notion, that there need to be a variety of measures for law enforcement, for any police department, to look at, in addition to just measuring their crime rate.
One thing that may have changed a little bit since the 90s is how readily folks view technology as a solution to problems.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
You looked very closely at body-worn cameras, some other technology. Mm-hmm. Where did you come down on the task force on adopting those kinds of technological innovations?
Well, we don't think that any one type of technology is a panacea. I know a lot of people would like to say that you could rush out and buy body cameras for everyone, and that's kind of a straightforward and simple answer. We can just take care of the problems by doing that. But we think it's a little more complex, and obviously community trust, community relationships are at the heart of having a good relationship. So that has to be the basic kind of bottom line here. But technology can be an asset and an addition to that. What we would recommend is that in evaluating whether or not to use body-worn cameras as an example, that a community would work with the police department. The police department would want to be consulting, for example, with civil liberties organizations, look at constitutional issues, look at privacy issues, and also look at national standards. So we recommend that the Justice Department, as an example, through its National Institute of Justice, set national standards in these areas or recommend guidelines in these areas, and promulgate or spread information, disseminate information about them, and that kind of information would be valuable for communities and departments considering these issues. But we also recommend and realize that this year it's body-worn cameras, but in the future there are going to be all sorts of other technologies that all of us can't even imagine. Certainly I can't. I'm not a tech person. My son would be the first to say that. But whether it's facial recognition technology or things that are just beyond our imagination at the moment. Other things will come down the road and be valuable to law enforcement, but have privacy aspects to them that probably will be a little bit scary, and we'll need to consider those ramifications.
We're talking now about how technology can gather vast swaths of information, and police departments and governments may keep that for a long time. But one of the significant findings of your task force is that we too often lack basic information about the number of police-involved shootings and other data. What can be done about gathering that kind of information, and what's the federal role here?
Well, Carrie, those are really good questions. We do think that more data needs to be gathered in a number of areas, and we make recommendations that this is a key area for the federal government, for a federal government role. For example, we recommend that police departments collect information and provide it to the federal government about officer-involved shootings, and also about the composition of their police departments in terms of a gender and racial makeup, because there's very little information available. There's some through the Bureau of Justice Statistics on the latter, but not complete. There are close to 18,000 state and local law enforcement agencies in the country, so that's a lot of departments to keep up on. But we don't have full information about that. And on officer-involved shootings, and also on use of force more broadly, and not simply shootings. So that kind of information would be very valuable. As you know, the FBI director, James Comey, spoke out about that recently and noted that in so many areas of life we have such good data, but on this kind of key issue, we don't.
Yeah, he said the notion that I can go up on Amazon and find out how many books are in a specific location, but I can't go on Google and find out how many police officers have shot unarmed people in Cleveland, for instance. It's truly extraordinary, that imbalance of information.
That's correct.
One of the things that people have had a hard time wrapping their head around since Ferguson, since the incident in Cleveland, since Staten Island, is the notion that the federal government can't just go in and issue edicts in these locations. How would you describe the federal role here in these 18,000 police agencies all over the country? What kind of power does the federal government have?
Well, Carrie, that is, again, a very good question, and it's one that I've been surprised, actually, that many Americans don't understand. I'll relate very quickly an incident that happened to me back in the 90s when I worked for the federal government for Janet Reno in the Justice Department. I was at an international conference on terrorism and talking to a German Justice Department official in that country, and he asked me why Janet Reno could not order every police chief in the United States to have all of the police officers under them in the, I explained there were 18,000 state and local law enforcement agencies, why she couldn't order all of them to undergo terrorism training. And I explained to him that she couldn't order any of them to do that. And I thought the man was going to faint. And then I explained the system of federalism in our country, which he didn't understand at all. But what's interesting to me is that when Chuck Ramsey and I were appointed the co-chairs of this task force on December 1st, that many reporters who came to me, certainly not a Carrie Johnson or some of the more sophisticated reporters, they asked me, as I talked about the task force assignment, they asked me whether President Obama, when our recommendations came in, could order police chiefs to do this and that. And I had to explain to reporters in this country that the President of the United States could not order police chiefs to do this, that, or the other. So obviously, in a society like ours, in our country, where federalism has set up local departments with local authority, the president and the federal government have quite limited powers and authorities. Of the 17,000 to 18,000 departments, half of them have 10 or fewer sworn police officers. So half of them are very small. And most of those receive no federal grants. So there's very limited leverage with them. In my view, the best way to work with them is through their professional associations, through groups like the National Sheriff's Association, through the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and through the states.
In your report outlining the rather limited federal role, emphasizes the issue of procedural justice.
Yes.
How does that implicate what we're talking about here today?
Well, I think that procedural justice, which is about fair, respectful treatment and explaining to people why something isn't happening. For example, simple example, if you're getting a traffic ticket, that you were speeding, why it's important in this area not to be speeding because there are a lot of kids who play near the street, etc. And to be polite during the transaction. And people come away with a better feeling even if they did get a ticket.
Your report says, and citing research, that people are more concerned about whether they're being treated fairly than the outcome of the incident.
Yes.
In other words, if you treat me fairly when I'm being arrested, I don't mind as much being arrested.
The research is very clear that people are research by Tom Tyler, Tracy Mears, who was on our task force, and others, that the way people are treated is far more important than the actual outcome. And if you think about it in your personal life, this is what people care about, how they are dealt with, whether they feel they're being treated fairly, and that they understand what the process and procedure is about. Think about going to get your driver's license renewed. Just the process, knowing how long you might have to wait, why there might be a delay, those kinds of things, and understanding what is involved. So those kind of things really do matter a lot. So taking that a step further, training is going to be a key part of changing culture in implementation of some of our recommendations. And that goes to the question of medium-sized and smaller departments here as well as the larger departments. So training recommendations are a key part of our report.
Law enforcement, as you know better than I, in some quarters is feeling under siege for these last months. But your report is not anti-law enforcement.
Oh,
in fact,
not at all.
You're calling for more support in certain areas.
Yes.
In addition to the training you just mentioned.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we are calling for more support, certainly in the training area, and we have an entire chapter, or a pillar as we call them, about officer safety and wellness. We see the amount of stress that's placed on officers just in the daily pursuit of their jobs. In fact, just this past week, my co-chair, Chuck Ramsey, who is commissioner in Philadelphia, went through a terrible situation where one of his officers, who he personally knows, was shot and killed during a robbery of a store in Philadelphia. And very sadly, Chuck Ramsey had to pull out of several events he and I were going to be doing together. It is a dangerous profession. It is a stressful profession, and many officers succumb to alcoholism, to suicide, have stress on their families. There's a high rate of divorce, of alcoholism, and substance abuse of other kinds as well. So it's a difficult profession. We call for provision of bulletproof vests for every police officer and for mandatory wear policies for those vests and mandatory safety belt wear policies as well, because many deaths of law enforcement officers come not from bullets, but from vehicular accidents, because they're racing to go to the scene of a crime, and many, because they want to be able to jump out when they get there, don't wear their seat belts because they have so much gear on, for one thing.
You also talk about a lack of sleep.
Yes.
Law enforcement working odd shifts, overtime. Right. Sleeplessness can cause a lot of these accidents as well.
Yes, that's correct.
We're going to open up to questions in just a moment. If there are any audience questions, I think there are some microphones set up. Please feel free to hop up. But before then, we're seeing in communities around the country deep fissures and deep emotion. But given how long you've done this, you have actually seen change in communities in Ohio, for instance.
Yes.
What did that take?
Well, it's again a very good point to go to, Carrie. Perhaps it's that I'm an optimistic person, but we did see examples of change that has occurred. Cincinnati, Ohio, which is one of the places that we took our listening session tour to, encountered some very difficult times back in 2000, 2001, and so. And it was under a Justice Department pattern and practice suit. It had a court-appointed monitor and so on. It has made great strides. Has every problem been solved? No, I don't think so. But we heard testimony from members of the community, from members of the police union there, who are working closely together. The people in the community who have come forward to lobby for more funding for the police department. Now that's pretty remarkable. People who said that it has taken a tremendous amount of hard work. And I think one thing we need to recognize here is that these problems didn't arise overnight, and in communities they won't be solved overnight. But it does take hard work, and it takes, it's about relationships. It's about the need to talk to each other. And one thing, and Chuck Ramsey has said this many times, law enforcement needs to own these problems. So there needs to be an acknowledgement of past and present participation in discrimination and injustice where that has occurred in order to move forward.
One of your other task force members, Connie Rice,
yes.
Achieved national prominence for suing the Los Angeles Police Department, and she has a rather different relationship with the LAPD.
Yes, and every time, as you say, Connie Rice, a member of our task force, every time we went on one of these listening tour listening sessions, we all introduced ourselves. Each time she introduced herself saying, I used to, civil rights attorney, I used to sue the LAPD, now I work with the LAPD. Pretty strong statement.
I can't quite see if we have any questions, so I'm going, oh yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Adam Bates with the Cato Institute. Ms. Robinson, you mentioned a limited role for the federal government, but you also mentioned this warrior mentality among police officers as a problem. Do you think federal programs like the Pentagon's 1033 program that provides military equipment to local police departments, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, Joint Drug Task Force, of which there are hundreds, do you think the federal government is in part responsible for this inculcation of this warrior mentality among local police? And what do you think police can do to combat this mentality?
I don't think that there's any one source of it. As far as the 1033 program is concerned, some of that equipment probably can be used and has been used for worthy purposes, for example, in hostage situations and the like. But I think it has to be used with good training. We did not delve deeply into the 1033 program because there's a separate interagency task force that's looking at that. What we did say, we have a recommendation that addresses the fact that if it has been misused in mass demonstrations, that there should be a federal investigation and potential sanctions around it. But to your broader point, I think that as in every facet of law enforcement, that it's possible that the federal role has contributed to that, but no more than state and local. I don't know that it's a greater contributor or not.
Laurie, just to play off this first panel that we heard talking about lower crime rates and how views of incarceration are changing.
Yes.
This presents an opportunity for law enforcement to free them up to be guardians and not warriors.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, I think that and we talk about that in a number of ways. For example, the ability of law enforcement to work in schools, to help in forging more positive relationships with young people. We talk about the potential for engaging with kids who are coming out of the juvenile justice system, the reentry role. Not that law enforcement will play a large piece in that, but on the adult side, with adults who are coming back from correctional facilities, and always law enforcement has wanted to keep an eye on people who are coming back in, but it doesn't necessarily have to be solely a negative eye. It could be kind of a positive eye. And we talk about the support for economic redevelopment in at-risk communities. So there are a variety of ways in which law enforcement can be playing a kind of an active role in assisting communities.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Susan Taylor, and I'm with the Church of Scientology National Affairs Office here in Washington. And just to tag on to what you were just saying as far as the police working with the community, there was a very successful program done under Chief Ramsey about 10, 15 years ago over in Anacostia, where he was working with the clergy, the community, and the police all working together, and actually lowered the rate of murders in Anacostia down to 0 for a certain period of time this one particular year. And I was just wondering, is the task force going to be looking into and giving a report on the many successful actions around the country of the police working with the community and treating this as a real issue of people, not just technology and not just numbers, but these are people that need to be worked with. And I just wondered if the task force was going to be doing a report on that or investigation into the successful actions.
Well, you raise, ma'am, a very good point about the large number of very successful community groups that are working out there. And we'd love to do something like that, but our life, we're like one of those moths that dies after a short period of time. Our lifespan is very short, and we will be turning into one of those short-lived moths very soon. I think by the end of April we'll probably be terminated. So I don't think we'll be filing much more in the way of reports. But your point is very well taken, and we note a few of those kinds of things in the report that we had heard about through our testimony and through the written statements that were filed. Certainly many in the youth area around the country, some through established types of programs like the Police Athletic League, Boys and Girls Clubs, the GREAT program that looks at preventing gang involvement and others. But there's so many that are not from the national groups but are locally grown. So it's great to hear about yours as well.
We have time for maybe one more short question. Yes, sir, in the back.
Hey, I'm Nelson Bunn. I'm the Director of Policy and Government Affairs with the National District Attorneys Association. And to go back to your comments about technology, we are struggling right now with seeing more and more digital evidence for cases, and we fully agree that privacy concerns have to be balanced. But when you have announcements like Apple's software with their encryption technology and even with a search warrant not being able to access some data, we have a lot of concerns over, criminals using their phones more and more for child abductions, for drug trafficking, issues like that. So I just wondered what your comments might be on balancing as we move forward the privacy concerns with, lawful access to some of these new emerging technologies.
No, we actually definitely were cognizant of that, and the I forget the phrase, but the concern about the blocking of access by law enforcement to needed evidence in those kinds of cases, the going black, I guess, going dark issue. So very cognizant of that and certainly recognize those concerns. But we didn't have time, of course, to go deeply into that. But it's certainly an area of concern broadly to law enforcement.